Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
We really say out of our Christian tradition that we are indeed social creatures, that we're saved as a people. We like to talk about the people of God that we read about in the Bible, that we're a member of a larger grouping, and that Christ has come to save the whole humankind, and that there's an essential solidarity of all human beings based on the presence of the Spirit. Therefore, the deepest reality is that we are united.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Robert Kirtland, a priest in the Diocese of Toledo and former pastor of Corpus Christi Parish at the University of Toledo. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of celebrating freedom in the United States. Here's Father Bacik.
Bob, I'm happy to have a chance to talk with you now. Since you are the former pastor of Corpus Christi University Parish, and I have recently followed in your footsteps, and am much appreciative of the time you've taken to show me around the campus and introduce me to people on the staff at the university and some of the top administrators and important people around there. So you've done a tremendous service for me that way, and I wanted to thank you for all of that and for coming on the program.
Well, I'm glad you're at the university, Jim, because I think the university is really a fine institution, and I think you bring an awful lot to it. I think you'll have a lot to contribute to it, and everybody around the university is important, even the students.
Truly.
Yeah.
The most important people, right?
That's
right.
right.
Why we've got the university. And I think that the university is so connected in with the community as a whole, and really so many ties that way.
Much more so. It enjoys a great deal of loyalty in the Toledo community, and I think it deserves that loyalty, too. I think it's a good, solid institution that contributes to the well-being of the city.
And you're going to be spending a year writing some things, right?
That's right. That's right. I'm looking forward to it. I'm like a schoolboy on holiday.
After 12 years as the pastor there.
12 years as the pastor, the bookkeeper, the maintenance man, the janitor.
You know, I think we really should mention that you're really being replaced by at least two people, because Father Dan Zach and myself will really be co-pastors of that university parish. And you are going to put that on your tombstone.
I'm having that carved on my tombstone. That's right.
Two to replace.
Yeah.
Bob, you're also an expert in things like constitutional law and so on, and I might draw a bit on that. I want to talk about the question of freedom, and especially freedom as we experience it here in the United States. And I'd like to perhaps approach it from the viewpoint of alternatives to begin with. Let's go back to sort of the founding myth that we find in our own country. It was common all throughout the history of our country to interpret the founding of the United States on the model of the Exodus myth that we find in the Hebrew Scriptures, interestingly enough. And so the notion was, here was this people in Europe under tyrants, as they saw it, who passed over a body of water and came to a new land, the Promised Land, and here in this Promised Land would enjoy the great fruits of their labors and really could enjoy freedom. And even our earliest founders, Thomas Jefferson is a good example, and Benjamin Franklin, and people like that all the way through our own time have tended to interpret that whole event on the model of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt, under the tyrant, going across the Red Sea and coming to the Promised Land. And so it represented in one way the whole idea of alternatives being available, and certainly one of the things we've celebrated in the history of our country.
I think that's very true, and I think particularly it was unique at that time because it was the first time that a civilized people had come upon a practically virgin land. There were the Native Americans, of course, around, but a very light sprinkling of population in a world that seemed to the Europeans to be fresh and new and to have an immense potential.
What was it? Doesn't it Chesterton line something about the United States was really founded on some sort of religious ideal, the first sort of country to be founded that way in the modern world? I forget the exact phrase, but it had that kind of ring to it. I mean, that we wanted that built into our documents. And
I'm not sure that was any more than the way they had of expressing themselves, because, of course, when they began coming to this country, some of them as a result of religious wars and persecution in Europe, they were all of them coming from 2 or 3 centuries of a great deal of religious controversy, and I think that religious forms of expression came to them very readily, especially, too, since the English-speaking peoples had been so largely formed in the use of the language by the King James version of the Bible, came so easily to their lips.
Yeah, those were their natural metaphors, that's for sure. That's the way they tended to interpret their experience. I think one of the interesting things is the way that has continued, though, throughout our history. I think it's, Lyndon Johnson in his inaugural address used that word covenant. We've made a covenant with the land. Very odd use of language. It's the referral to the biblical language again. And we've really done that throughout our history to a remarkable degree.
Yes, and the farther back you go, I think the more frequently you find it. You find a great deal in Lincoln and certainly in Jefferson himself, Madison.
Yeah, I think it was Jefferson in his inaugural, one of that he made that explicit reference to saying, we're founded as of Israel of old. He really made that very explicit.
Oh, yes. Yes, it was an image that came very easily.
I'm thinking of another way of bringing in this idea of alternatives, Bob, when we're... There's a book by Sidney Mead called The Lively Experiment, in which he talked about freedom in the United States and thought it very much a function of our geography. It's interesting to reflect on, that here we had a land in which we could always move west.
Yes.
That when any troubles occurred in a given colony and there was real dissent, the thing you did at that point was to move out and move to a new place, go further west and establish something new. And he thinks really that geographical factor has influenced our whole notion of freedom, that it's always suggested to us that there is a virgin land ahead of us, that there's open spaces somehow, that indeed you could always find alternatives again just in terms of a new living situation. We might contrast that with the way people experience freedom in other lands, like India, for example, where you're living on top of one another, where the population is so dense, or even places in Europe like the Netherlands, which would be so densely populated, where you don't have that same feeling, perhaps, of alternative. I think growing up in the United States, we clearly have our own flavor of freedom.
Yes.
We know it in a distinctive way, and probably that's the thing we want to get at. And I think that is a contributing factor. For some reason I just flash here on motorcycle people, the way they like to get on motorcycles, the young people, and just go and drive. And I must say I experienced a little bit of that in my own life after I had been in England studying at Oxford for a while. I didn't have a car, and I felt very restricted, and I didn't get around, and I was very confined in place. I couldn't really travel much or do anything. I spent all the time in my room in the library. And when I got back here, just to get in the car and drive was like a thrill.
Oh, yes. And, of course, that happens to many young Americans today when they turn 16. The car is more than simply a means of transportation. It is a medium of freedom. But I think a large part of that is our memory, too, because we're becoming more crowded. And I do think that in the back of our minds is the dream of riding to the ridge where the West commences, the idea of a frontier not that long gone from the memory or from the realities of our life in this country, whose resources were available to the individual. I think what attracts many people, for example, to Alaska today, or even to the Canadian West, is the prospect of having some more of that spatial freedom, as you speak of it, where the individual does have the resources of a frontier available to him in a way that most of us in the continental United States today do not. We speak of space as a new frontier, but space is a frontier whose resources are certainly not available to us as individual persons.
You mentioned that it's a memory for us, this spatial kind of freedom. I think that's an important point. It lurks in our psyche. I think it happens in terms of the cowboy image, for example, and the popularity of Western movies where you've got wide open spaces, or the success of Marlboro in their advertising campaign for their cigarettes and putting the man on the horse out in the middle of a plain, and a very autonomous kind of freedom. And it's interesting the way we've continually tried to come back to that. Think of John Kennedy and his metaphor, the new frontier.
Yes.
That, in other words, when we live in a country now that is more populated and where the two coasts are linked, it's interesting that competition between Los Angeles and New York in this way, and the way baseball moved out there and so on, and you saw that whole shift from the east, and then the importance of the West Coast, and now the whole importance of the Sun Belt in our politics, and that's where jobs are. I picked up a hitchhiker the other day, and he was saying, boy, I'm going south. That's where the jobs are. You know, I'm heading down to Houston, Texas.
Yes.
And so, you know, you have that feeling that that's where the growth is. So the geography has changed in a sense. The real space has changed, and yet there's that notion of frontier, new frontier, that still rings a nostalgic note in us. And you mentioned space. I don't know how that's going to function for us. Maybe in some ways it will carry that on for us in the days ahead, people going into space and all that. Maybe that'll be the way we gather that whole notion of spatial freedom and carry it with us.
That is, I think, one of the possibilities. There are two consequences, I think, of that. One is that I suspect that we Americans, perhaps more than others, resent limitations on spaces. We become a more crowded country, and the population rises, and more land is closed to the individual. That there is a resentment that it is not characteristic, it seems to me, of Europeans, the Europeans that I've known. And on the other hand, the effort of politicians, you've mentioned Lyndon Johnson, you mentioned John Kennedy, appealing to that idea of frontier in the hope that they can translate the dream that represents, or seems to represent for us, into a more spiritual kind of sense of joint enterprise and the prospect of prosperous undertaking.
Trying to bring it into a modern context, really.
Yeah.
You know, I just thinking again, I think of that contrast, the way we experience freedom in others and wanting our own space. We have, when some of the Vietnamese people came to our community, and I've heard this from others too, I had to visit the home late at night one time to bring them news of a meeting the next day, and they had in the house there a number of bedrooms, but they all slept in one place, in one room.
Yes.
And that is a very foreign idea to us. I contrast that with the movement in the United States, where more and more people are living alone.
Oh, yes.
By sort of by choice. You know, a lot of single people now, instead of pairing up and so on, want their own place, their own space to take care of. And it's very much this feeling of being autonomous, I guess, and our distinctive notion of freedom.
I think there's no question about that, although I think one of the things that the nature of American life today implies is that freedom no longer demands the same kind of responsibility that it once did. The man who put his belongings and his wife and children on a wagon and headed out to the West in the early days was a man who knew that reality was going to extract a large measure of responsibility, that they had to make it on their own, and it demanded a great deal. I think today we've been delivered from an awful lot of the threats, at least those induced by nature, that early Americans had, and in consequence, it seems to me that too often we're looking on freedom as an exemption from responsibility, and that certainly was alien to the mind and to the reality of life of our American predecessors. I have no doubt about that.
That's well put, and I think raises, you know, a whole critique of the kind of notion of freedom that we have in the United States, that I think so far as we've been talking, we've been sort of celebrating that or looking at it positively, and you and I enjoy that measure of freedom in our lives and so on. And yet a criticism needs to be mounted, I think, in some ways. We need to make judgment upon that from a higher perspective, probably from our Christian perspective especially. My phrase is always that the cross remains judge of the flag, and as a symbolic way of saying that our Christian tradition moves us to somehow make judgments about the culture in which we live, and to celebrate its good side and also be ready to criticize it. And I think that you've raised that question there of sort of an excessive individualism that seems to have resulted from all of this. So when you're looking at that cowboy image of freedom now and just being able to move out, you have there in the modern mind very much a sense, hey, no ties. You know, I have no responsibilities to anybody else. I'm on that motorcycle and I go off on my own. nobody can hold me down. I think very often we males in the United States maybe experience that in a slightly different way than women. I always thought that Marlboro sold more to men than to women, and
probably because of that imagery. That's
yeah, and because there is this sense of not getting boxed in and not wanting to be cornered. I mean, you and I doing counseling of young people know how often that problem sort of arises, where the young man in a situation begins to feel hemmed in or boxed in or cornered somehow in the relationships in which he's involved and wants to break out. I got to get away from all of that,
Yeah, and how many people resent, for example, their jobs because they find, especially young people, and as you say, we both run into this, young people who marry. And the minute they do, then they're concerned about job tenure, about security and seniority. They've made investments in a house and an insurance program, take care of their old age, to put the kids through college, and they feel that they're trapped. And of course, the early American, and this was one of Jefferson's principal points about that whole idea, the early American was an individual entrepreneur. He was a man on a small farm, characteristically, and he had only himself to blame or praise if he was successful or unsuccessful.
But as you well put before, he had his family to take care of. There was reality built in the responsibility, you said.
Yes.
And that's a telling phrase, I think. And I suppose the new situation is that the result of technocracy and the advances that we have made, and the fact that perhaps people are more affluent, and that we have new living situations and other lifestyles that are seen in our culture as being all right, that now creates a new possibility. That is, that reality wouldn't force one to be responsible.
That's right.
That it is really possible in today's world to begin to live sort of as though one had no ties. I was talking to a group of salesmen the other day and talking about one of the problems of their offspring going to college and sort of not remembering the sacrifices the parents made in order to get them there.
Yes.
And boy, there were a lot of heads nodding, a lot of parental generation people saying, yeah, I get that feeling too, like they think they have that coming, like it's a free ride and they're on a lark, and I wish they'd be working harder, and maybe they don't remember when their parents gave up a vacation in order that they could get there. So the ties are there. My sense is that we're social creatures. We're interdependent. We can't get away from that, and yet, in reality, and yet mentally we can escape it or pretend like those ties aren't there, or like we don't have the responsibilities. But I think that's when we're not being good citizens then, and that's when we're not being good members of our family, of our church. We don't recognize what we've received. We wouldn't have any of these things without those ties, without the previous generations. And yet people want to go on their own.
Yeah, that's another commentary, I think, on the contrast between America today and early America, that it's perhaps a sad commentary on human beings. We speak highly of community and how important community is to human beings. And yet at the same time, I have the feeling that for most of us, community does not become a reality except when we're compelled to it by necessity. That people in the small rural community that was typical America until the beginning of this century obviously were interdependent in very many ways upon one another. Even in communication, you and I are sitting here talking, we're responding to one another, but the technology of our world today has led us to be saying something now to a lot of people who are going to be listening to your program and listen to it regularly, and they don't have to do anything back. All they have to do is listen. And of course, if a person wants this artificial substitute for human companionship, all he has to do is turn on the ever-present portable radio, even as he jogs along or rides his bike, and he's got an AirSats company that is not demanding of him.
It's an interesting phenomenon to see people walking around by themselves with those earphones on these days, isn't it? I mean, it's more of a privatizing tendency. I was at the Catholic Theological meeting recently in New York, and Robert Bellow, the great humanistic sociologist, gave a talk about still saying that in his mind the great problem that we were facing now was this privatizing tendency. He called it a privatizing bureaucratic tendency that we have, putting together bureaucracy and this sort of excessive individualism. He was recalling Max Weber's idea of the iron cage, that we feel that we're caged in by the bureaucracy today. The new imprisonment is that you've got to stand in line to get things done, and no one seems to be able to handle your problem, and if you want your telephone fixed, you can't seem to accomplish it, or you've got to go through all this paperwork in order to get things done, and government forms get greater and all that, and people are feeling now a new kind of boxed-in feeling, the iron cage of bureaucracy. And then his idea, I guess, was that people then retreat even more into a private world, like they're going to sit on their back porch and get away from all of that. And maybe we get so much of it at that impersonal level that we think we don't want more action in the neighborhood, or don't want more involvement in the parish, or in the political life of the community, because we're getting so much of it, of being caged in a way. People want to go camping instead of getting involved in a parish liturgy committee or something.
I'm sure that the growth of camping as a way for Americans to take holiday is not just because it's a less expensive way to travel, but also because it does appeal, as you suggest, to this sense of wanting to get away by ourselves, to be free of people who are leaning on us.
Right. Now, the hunger for community is a mixed thing today. A lot of churchy people these days are saying everyone's got a hunger for community and so on. But I don't think it's really true. Many people have a hunger to get away from communities.
Not only that, but we may hunger for it in one idealistic sense. It's nice to think of times when people belong to one another. But I think most of the time, most of us think about that only when we need something.
Yeah.
But when it's a matter of somebody else who comes along with something to lay on us, we're a little less idealistic about the importance of community. There's nothing. I was going to say there was nothing that bothers me about that too. Especially the pervasiveness of technology and the electronic substitute for human company, and that is that our forebears, by the necessity of their lives, had a lot of time, if they were so minded, to be reflective. The man who spent hours walking a lonely row behind a plow, the man who, Jefferson, riding back and forth in his carriage to Monticello, taking 5 days for the trip from Washington, those people had a lot of time to think, and I think that an awful lot of the strong, articulate convictions that mark our past and provide some of the monuments of the freedom we celebrate on the 4th of July were actually forged in those periods of silent reflection.
And something that we really don't have so much of today.
That's right.
You know, I think in mounting this critique, we really say out of our Christian tradition that we are indeed social creatures, that we're saved as a people. We like to talk about the people of God that we read about in the Bible, that we're a member of a larger grouping, and that Christ has come to save the whole humankind, and that there's an essential solidarity of all human beings based on the presence of the Spirit in our lives and in our hearts, the recesses of our being, and that therefore, the deepest reality is that we are united and that we're called together. And therefore, out of that tradition, I think we have to look at our American sense of freedom and celebrate the ways that we do have alternatives and be grateful for that we've had the chance to expand our capabilities and so on. But at the same time, I think we have to criticize any excessive individualism here that won't meet responsibilities. I think we have to begin to say again that we're responsible to these larger communities, that if this country is going to continue to be free and we're going to carry on our heritage, it's because we're involved politically, because we're willing to vote and learn about the candidates and issues, because we're willing to be involved in voluntary associations and so on to try to better our world and our society. So it seems to me that our Christian heritage has an important thing to say, and I should really say their Judeo-Christian heritage, because surely the Jewish people carried a sense of community with them to a magnificent degree.
Wonderfully strongly, yes, indeed. And, I think that obviously we've got to look on the freedom that we have today on a measure that people have never known really in the history of the world before. We attained it as a challenge and an opportunity, but a challenge to a joint enterprise of growth and development and fulfillment of the best that is within us.
Bob, when we're trying to fill out this picture, don't we have to say as well that we've got to say there's a lot of Americans who don't have these alternatives, who don't feel the alternatives. They feel locked in. There's all those people in New York City, when I was living there, walk around, they feel like they're imprisoned there. They can't imagine alternatives. You know, they don't think about going on camping trips or moving someplace to find different jobs or something. They feel locked into that whole ghetto situation there. And so we've got, You know, the American dream of freedom for all is one of the most magnificent things we've ever achieved in the history of humankind, it seems to me. And I like the way Martin Luther King called upon that dream. But at the same time, we have to recognize that it is not fulfilled, that the precise problem for many people is they don't have the alternatives. They feel locked in. They are in that hellish circle of poverty and really don't know how to get out. So we've got this high level of black teenage unemployment just as one symbolic example or terrible example of this problem. No alternatives.
Yes.
And they have to figure a way, I suppose, to begin to deal with that.
Partly, I'm sure that's a want of imagination. Although I have the impression, like you, that New York City, for example, much of the East Coast is very much like Europe in very many ways. The young couple who are in love, who date for 5 or 6 or 7 years because they don't really dare to enter upon marriage till they've got a substantial down payment on the house that they're going to buy or something of that sort. And I think that's atypical of American feeling as I have known it, as we've grown up with it here in the Midwest. And I think it's to be pitied. They're to be pitied.
Okay, Bob, we've been talking about this whole idea of freedom here and trying to look at it from the viewpoint of alternatives and trying to say that our country is founded really on the idea of establishing alternatives, getting away from the tyrants and coming here to the new land, the promised land, where God's blessings could flow. And the magnificent thing that you and I and all the rest of us enjoy, this freedom because of our forefathers who established all of this for us and gave us the opportunity. And so from our own Christian perspective, then we look at that and we say, thank God for those alternatives. And those of us who enjoy the riches of this country have to be grateful to the Lord for all of that. At the same time, we have to be ready to criticize it. And I think criticize it in two ways. One, the alternatives are not there for all Americans. They simply, the facts are they have not had the opportunities or don't know how to break out of it, or we haven't had the imagination to accomplish it as a people. And the other thing is the criticism of the excessive individualism, and to remember that really we are social creatures, that indeed all of us are interrelated, and that we have this one God who is the Father of us all.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Robert Kirkland, a priest in the Diocese of Toledo and former pastor of Corpus Christi Parish at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was celebrating freedom in the United States. If you have any questions about today's program or have any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.